So, good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Before we start, I just like to mention that today's webinar is being simultaneously translated into French. So, if you prefer to listen in French, you can switch between the English and French channels at any time. So, let's start. We're so glad you could join us today as we officially launch our latest impact report, focusing on the rapid action grants from our Save Our Species African Wildlife Initiative. This report is all about the amazing accomplishments and invaluable lessons we've gained from these grants. It really highlights how crucial rapid response funding is when it comes to tackling urgent conservation emergencies across Africa. As you know, Africa is home to incredible biodiversity, but it also faced many challenges, from habitat loss and poaching to human-wildlife conflict and the growing impacts of climate change. The COVID-19 pandemic only made things worse, hitting conservation efforts hard with economic downturns, reduced tourism, and weakened environmental protections. Our rapid action grants were created to meet these threats head-on, giving conservationists the tools they need to respond quickly and effectively. So in today's webinar, you'll hear directly from three of our grantees who have been on the front line managing conservation emergencies in South Africa, Uganda, and Cameroon. These experienced conservationists have faced some of the toughest challenges, but yet they've managed to keep crucial conservation going. Their stories of resilience and innovation are truly inspiring and offer valuable lessons for anyone working on conservation. So we're very grateful to have them here today, sharing their insights and experiences with us. I'm also very excited to introduce you to our facilitators for today's session, Dr. Hans Bauer from WILDCRU at the University of Oxford, and a long-term family member of the IUCN Species Survival Commission community. So with 3 decades of experience in lion conservation, especially in West, Central, and the Horn of Africa, Hans will be guiding us through what I'm sure will be a very engaging and insightful discussion today. So before I hand things over to Hans, I'd like to take a moment to sincerely thank the European Union for the steadfast support and partnership in this initiative. Their commitment on biodiversity conservation in Africa has been vital for us to be able to make these achievements. So without the collaboration and the funding, none of these critical conservation actions wouldn't have been possible. So thank you. And with this, please join me in welcoming our facilitator, Dr. Hans Bauer. Over to you, Hans.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. And welcome to 88 participants. That's what my screen says. If people joined us after the housekeeping announcement, let me just reiterate, if you want to follow this in French, then you can click at the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen. You can follow this in French. Now, the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to give a short introduction, and I'm going to start by defining crisis. And I actually looked it up yesterday because it's one of those words that you think what it means, you know what it means, but when you look it up, you actually read it means time of great confusion or suffering, a dangerous situation. And so in the news, when they speak about the housing crisis or the cost of living crisis, I think that's a little bit inflation of the word crisis. Not everything is a crisis. The climate crisis is a serious crisis, the Darfur crisis. Extinction is one of the biggest crises of our times, and it's one of the issues that gathers us here in this webinar. There's another crisis, COVID. We've moved on. It's been months that I used the word COVID, but in the report that we're launching today, the word appears 79 times. COVID, remember those days when we were all sitting in isolation, when there were severe restrictions? 7 million people died. the economy lost about $10 trillion. I don't even know what that is. I don't even know how to visualize $10 trillion. In Africa, the health impacts were perhaps a bit less, but it was definitely a disaster for conservation in terms of ending tourism. And there was simply no travel. I remember in 2000, there were no flights. And so the Rapid Action Grants, it's a program that was launched well before COVID, but it it happened during COVID, and I mean it continued throughout COVID, and so many of the projects that are reported on in the report speak of COVID and the consequences and how they address the challenges. But it's not only COVID. Rapid action grants were made available to address all sorts of emergencies. And if you read the report, you can see that some of the other types of emergencies have been invasive species. Actually, one of the speakers today is going to talk about invasive species. Conflict, human-wildlife conflict, and habitat conversion. Then there are things like extreme weather events or extreme geological events like volcanoes. Or I don't think we have volcano eruptions in this report, but it's one of those disasters that can happen, and that when you're running a conservation program, is you just didn't anticipate, and still you have to face it. Of course, COVID, but there's also other diseases or the prevention of other diseases that is important and that came up as a topic in this report. One that is perhaps less mentioned here, but I think armed conflict and insurgencies and jihadism, especially where I live in Mali, it's the topic of the day, and it's also I would say one of those emergencies that make work of conservationists difficult. Now, the rapid action grants, they occupy a very particular niche in the conservation funding landscape. Many of the people who are watching online, they will be familiar with Darwin grants or National Geographic grants or Mohammed bin Zayed, but none of those actually offer a window for emergency funding. They assume that the situation is stable. They assume that you have a long-term goal and that at the end of a project cycle, you'll have some sustainable system in place, and they're slow. Rapid action grants stood out over the last few years in providing relatively rapid funding. I remember the forms. The form was, you could fill it out in an afternoon. You could get the money within a few weeks and then go and do your thing. That's unique in the conservation funding landscape, I think, in my experience, and so it was really important to have the Save Our Species rapid action grants during the outbreak of COVID-19, and many people found their way to this window. Now, the IUCN Save Our Species program, the SOS program, it had two windows. One is the rapid action grants that we're reporting on today, and the other one is the threatened species grants. And those were grants that were aimed at the conservation of iconic species, lions, amongst others. And so by design, they had projects on enigmatic wildlife. Now, the rapid action grants didn't have a taxonomic focus. And if you read the report that we are launching today, you will see that the taxonomic diversity is enormous. We have reports of projects on plants, on invertebrates, on snakes, on frogs, on marine life, things that a diversity that is rare in conservation funding and where iconic species often eclipse other species. Not the case in rapid action grants. Even species that rarely attract attention got attention in this grant program. Now, of course, when you're trying to conserve lions or trying to conserve an aquatic ecosystem, it's a whole different type of intervention. And so from this taxonomic diversity, we also find that the diversity of interventions that took place funded by rapid action grants is enormous. And so it really makes for a very interesting report. If for those of you who don't have it, I'm sure that a facilitator can put a link in the chat so that you can put it on the screen and scroll through it while we're attending this webinar. I really recommend that you read it. It's good good reading. This report is launched at the towards the end of a cycle of the rapid action grants. And I think today we'll be hearing from speakers and in the Q&A we'll be hearing how this program really helped in addressing conservation emergencies. And such emergencies, obviously, we had the big one, the crisis, the COVID crisis. COVID crisis, I'm afraid, will not be the last crisis. I'm sure there'll be more crises. And so I think at the end of this webinar, I hope that we will have a better understanding of what an emergency is, what a conservation emergency is, how you can address it, and also perhaps to reflect on what do we do when there are conservation emergencies? Is this an important program? What is the future beyond this SOS grant cycle? One final question that I want people to have in the back of their mind is that obviously when you run an emergency program, when you're addressing emergencies, you're fighting fires and you're not preoccupied by sustainability. Obviously, though, that is eventually you have to move on after an emergency. And when I was reading the report, I was really wondering how some of the projects were coping with the situation today, 1-2 years after the grant. And it's something that I'm really looking forward to hear, especially from the 3 speakers. My time's up. It's 2:15. By now, we have 109 participants. So I think we are plateauing, and I think that everyone is now ready to listen to our speakers. Before we go to the 3 grantees that will present their projects, we have 2 other speakers. And the first one is a keynote address from the EU. And so I hand over the floor now to Nadia, Cannata. Are you there?
Good morning, good afternoon.
Yes.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I hear you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Let me start by very quickly introduce myself. So I'm based in Brussels for the European Commission and in the International Partnership Directorate and in the unit dealing with environment and natural resources. So I oversee from Brussels the SOS program, but actually I had the chance to spend the last 4 years in Uganda. So I also know the SOS program from the beneficiary perspective, which is also very good. So I'm particularly happy to be here today. I will not go too much in detail in these opening remarks because we will come back in the panel. So I think I will really focus a bit on why the European Union decided to support such initiative and the focus of the initiative from our perspective. So as we have already heard from the previous speakers, we have a wildlife loss that is taking place at an unprecedented rate. It was already unprecedented when this program was developed, and it's getting worse in some cases, as already mentioned by the impact that the COVID pandemic had. But we also have big commitments. And I think this is very important, not to focus only on the difficulties, but also to look at the importance that is given more and more to this topic. And for example, I would like us to remember what is one of the targets and see one of the long-term goals of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the human-induced extinction of known threatened species to halt. So this is extremely ambitious, and of course it requires the participation of everybody. And I know that today we are all very much aware of what has to be done and committed to address the different challenges. And I think, of course, we are all aware of the fact that it's undeniable that species are the fundamental component of ecosystem, and we all rely on their survival for existence. And this is really important in a continent like Africa, which hosts some of the world's most biodiverse landscapes on the planet. So this is a very important consideration also of why we have been supporting this initiative specifically on the African continent. And it is for, I would say, a twofold reason. There is a lot of old, new, and emerging severe ecological threats that have already been mentioned, but there is also on the other side a richness and a wealth on the continent that really has to be protected. So the European Commission decided in 2016 to join forces with IUCN and to invest an amount of 15.5 million euro to support the Save Our Species African Wildlife Initiative. And the idea was really, we know that we all need to work together. It's a question of partnership. But I think we really wanted with this program to work on addressing the issues behind the fact that we have threatened species by supporting local communities and NGOs that are rooted in the field. So what we call the frontline people that are really especially around the areas that are hosting the threatened species. And of course, by doing this, we recognize the very critical and important role that the civil society plays. So this is why really building the capacities of the people that are active on the front line of conservation has always been keen and is keen in this program. And of course, there have been many situations related to poaching, relating to fragilities, where civil society organizations have been needing support to address them and play a critical role. And this is where this program has really been very instrumental over the past years. So this is why it has been interesting also to see the variety of interventions from rescue, rehabilitation of species, disease management, habitat protection, restoration, and public awareness. And I would like to really take a moment before I end this introductory remark to talk about the communication and awareness component, because it has been, we will come back to this in the panel, but let's say that it has been a very important component, and this is where the impact report plays a crucial role, because it's not only a question of giving visibility to what has been done, but it has really been a question of raising awareness also among actors that are not directly concerned by conservation and the wider public who not always knows, not always is not always aware. So this is why communication has really been both a tool to raise awareness, disseminate stories, and reach people that are not, let's say, us today. So beyond the group of those that are already convinced. So I will not take more time because, as I said, we will come back to all these points later. But I wish you a great webinar, and I really look forward to the 3 stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you for the generosity of the EU, but also for those important words. Yes, communication, PR. It's something that I hadn't even thought about, and it's good that many people read this report. So everyone, please do share. Then I now pass the floor to Anne, who will present the program, who will present the Africa Wildlife Initiative program, and coming to us, I think, from Gland, from IUCN. Anne, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Hans, for your introduction. Next slide, please. So my name is Anne Mugo, and as Hans indicated, I'm a grant coordinator with IUCN. And I'll walk you through a few slides just to introduce a little bit, this initiative and what has led us to this point. Next slide, please. So the IUCN Save Our Species African Wildlife Initiative is, as you've already heard, a great partnership between IUCN and the European Union. And I think, and this partnership for us was really important for 2 main things. One, it was an opportunity to translate the global ambition into local action. And secondly, to be able to provide a mechanism, a trusted mechanism, by which global actors or donors, if I may be able to channel funding to frontline actors, such as the organizations that you will hear from and others that are possibly listening in on this webinar. This initiative was really designed to address the underlying causes of the decline in threatened carnivore species, the large carnivores and the smaller carnivores. And the premise being, there wasn't really, not to say that, these were the most important species and forgetting everything else, but was really because the understanding was, given limited resources, that actions targeting the species would have a trickle-down effect and potentially impact other threatened species in, target landscapes and sites. And so the actions that, were supported through this initiative, also sought to address issues related to human-wildlife conflict, which, as we know, is a massive issue, the direct poaching of the species, law enforcement support for some of our partners, and primarily working with communities to understand, the challenges that they were facing and to work towards development of innovative livelihood solutions. Next slide, please. And as you may already have heard, the initiative had 2 main types of grants. So the threatened species grants, which are more programmatic in approach, have a higher funding ceiling, and are more like medium to long term. And then the rapid action grants, which were really designed to respond to emergency situations and were more short-term and in scope. And this is really the focus of the webinar and the focus of the report that we're going to talk about. So I want to just dig a little bit deeper into the rapid action grants. Next slide, please. And so, we were talking about, yes, what is emergency responses? And we kind of, designed and thought about it. And we said, the aim of these responses should really be to mitigate the immediate impacts that wildlife and communities and habitats may be facing from certain things. So, for example, I think you had about diseases, right? Wildlife diseases. This was again during the time of COVID, and the impacts that it caused in terms of operational support, in terms of the impact on wildlife, the impact on communities. So that was obviously a rather obvious example of an emergency response. But there are other things. For example, there's been a change. There's been an escalation of threat. For example, or you urgently need a rapid assessment to determine the status of a species, or you really feel that starting to develop public awareness and education campaigns to lead to change of how people perceive things and how people do things that may be beneficial. And so I wouldn't get into too much detail because I want you to read the report, but these are some of the kind of emergency responses that we considered. Next slide, please. And so we looked at all the outcomes of the projects that were implemented, and we wanted to do things. We wanted to use this as an opportunity to reflect. What went well, what did not go well, what were the successes, what were the impacts, what were the lessons learned. And secondly, we also wanted to celebrate. I think some of the frontline actors do not get enough opportunities to celebrate their successes. I know sometimes it can feel all doom and gloom, but we wanted to use this opportunity to celebrate their successes. And so at a glance, we awarded 54 grants to 46 recipients in 23 countries, impacting 58 threatened species. So not only the large carnivores, but a few other species also benefited from these actions. And so these grants actually were initiated, interestingly, just before the COVID pandemic. And so I would like to also credit the European Union, because when the COVID pandemic, hit, they were the first to say, let us provide COVID relief. So COVID relief to organizations. I think we all know the kind of impacts all round. And so our funding through these grants became really targeted at supporting frontline actors during these difficult times. And so, gave birth to the report that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. And so just to unpack a little bit more, I did say that it was the impact targeted more than just, or was felt by more than just the carnivore species. We did impact 9 bird species, 1 fish species, 2 plant species, and 4 reptile species. Greater, I think, and this you again see in the report, the impact on livelihoods and communities, both directly and indirectly, in the form of employment or just, the generational development of livelihood support, which took different forms, from community gardens to, cooperatives to, various interesting things that were developed and that were very beneficial to communities. But, to really say again, our report, it was difficult to talk about each and every one of those grants, 54 of them. And so we had to pick a sample. But that is not to say that we do not recognize the work of each and every one of these organizations. And I hope they will, they're here to celebrate with us all the amazing work that was done. And so, we had a, reflection, and we realized that these rapid grants did actually elevate and improve the institutional capacities of some of these organizations and enabling them to continue to take action, especially during the COVID-19 challenging times. These grants were also instrumental in assisting in the continuing challenge of tackling the underlying threats to species. And so, because there was a concern that all the amazing work that had been done, all the conservation gains that had been secured would have been lost, due to loss of funding, due to loss of momentum, and due to just, I think, an increase in the threat levels. And so that funding did actually make a difference in that way. Primarily also was the support that was provided to local communities who at that time then became, in many instances, more reliant on their natural resources, and they went back to the basics, went back to the natural resources and needed to exploit this more aggressively. And so a lot of support was provided in terms of how to work, in that kind of environment and to support them. And then, obviously, in terms of just, being responsive and reactive to human-wildlife conflict and habitat management challenges. Next slide, please. And so a few lessons that I want to share, and I'm happy for you to explore this further in the report. Adaptive management. Our strategies need to be adaptive to changing environments, as we saw with the COVID pandemic, and to use those opportunities as learning and use those learnings to develop and build the work that we do. There's the importance of being collaborative and working across sectors. So not just in our comfort zone within the conservation space, but including, economic and other social sectors, and really engaging all stakeholders all around. And really just thinking about funding. Conservation needs long-term funding. And that is, I think, one message that is quite clear, but also looking at innovative ways in terms of how we can fund our work. Next slide, please. And I conclude by really talking about the importance of communities, that they really need to be engaged at all levels. This is really important for sustainability and for success. And yes, obviously, and I think it was a good reflection that the rapid action response, did actually make a difference. And we look forward to ways and means to continue that kind of support. And finally I'm sharing the slide with the code in case you haven't had a chance to download the report. Please do so, and we're happy to hear from you. And with those few remarks, I hand over back to you, Hans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for I think letting us understand the framework within which these projects were executed. But now I think we're all thirsty to hear about what actually happened in the field. Without further ado, I think we should listen to the three speakers of today. We're going to start with Dr. Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka from Uganda. After that, we'll have Matthew Norval from South Africa, and we'll end with Dr. Aristide Takoukam Kamla from Cameroon. I now give the floor to the first speaker, Dr. Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka. Gladys, are you there?
Good morning. Oh, I'm actually in America right now, so it's morning for me. I'm very excited to be here today. I'd like to really thank IUCN, SOS, and European Union for enabling us to have this rapid action grant just in time, because it was a really critical time during the COVID-19 pandemic, when things were all going crazy and funds were urgently needed to do things to prevent very distinctive threats to the endangered mountain gorillas. Our NGO was set up 20 years ago to prevent disease between people and gorillas and other wildlife, based on experiences I had working as a first veterinarian for the Uganda Wildlife Authority when gorillas picked up scabies from the local community because of ranging in community land. And of course, these threats continue with tourism and other things. During this period of the pandemic, and also believe because of the support of IUCN and other donors, we're really honored to receive an award from United Nations Environment Programme in Science and Innovation for a One Health approach to conservation, and to be appointed on the WHO Scientific Advisory Group for the origin of novel pathogens. Our main aim was to minimize human-related emergency threats to mountain gorillas and their habitats due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because we can easily make each other sick, of course, if they could pick up scabies, what about COVID? If you would seem to remember the time of you have to maintain a social distance, put on masks, and even everyone was told don't come closer than 2 meters closer to anyone. So this was something that we're very concerned about. So we wanted by 2022, we received the funding in 2020, we wanted by 2022 to identify and prevent the risk of viral pathogen transmission among a core group, including CTPH, UA, and all frontline worker groups and households. And to do this by a comparative viral pathogen analysis to make sure that 200 habituated gorillas out of the 449 and 130 humans in close contact with gorillas are tested for COVID. 100% of the households would have knowledge and skills to prevent cross-species disease transmission. And we wanted 100% of the frontline workers to have equipment to safely interact with people, like PPE equipment, which was urgently needed. And actually by households, we mean all the homes in high human and gorilla conflict parishes around the park, as well as the park rangers and gorilla guardians. We also wanted to, don't know if I should change this. We also wanted to have, can you keep going? We also wanted to look at illegal activities. So disease was the main issue, but there was also the issue of illegal activities. As the Rapid Action Report has said, poaching went up. So we wanted to make sure that people are not so desperate that they have to enter the forest to poach, and decided to improve community households so that they can have something to eat and they don't have to enter the forest. We also wanted to support the coffee farmers who had already started engaging before in 2016, and we wanted to be able to increase their coffee, especially as tourists were not coming anymore. And we also wanted to improve the capacity of the Uganda Wildlife Authority, the government that manages the wildlife, to be able to monitor the gorillas and other wildlife. We also wanted to, so these are all the things we wanted to do to minimize the human-related emergency threats. Next slide, please. So looking at the first threat we addressed, which was disease, I think one of the most significant things that happened is that we advocated for the upgrading of grade 8 viewing regulations in Uganda. This had always been on the IUCN guidelines, but it hadn't yet happened. And so during the COVID-19 pandemic, CTPH led the effort, working with other conservation NGOs, to make sure that everybody wears masks who comes close to gorillas, whether they're tourists in the park, rangers, veterinarians, researchers, or when gorillas range outside the park. So as you can see over here was the first training when everybody put on masks that day. And then over here, the gorilla guardians who were trained to herd gorillas back when they come out were also trained to put on masks when they're doing this, as they sensitize people about how to prevent COVID between themselves and between people and gorillas. And then also we worked with, because we were on the Ministry of Health COVID-19 task force team, we set up 59 village COVID task forces in 59 villages in parishes where gorillas are always coming out, and we're able to provide pulse oximeters and infrared thermometers to all the village health and conservation teams. This team of people actually reach that time they're reaching over 7,000 households with over 40,000 people. And so we made sure that during the pandemic, all these homes, almost all of them, were able to get this critical information. We trained and equipped 415 park rangers so that when they visit the gorillas, they know what to do and how they can better manage tourists so that they don't get too close. The government actually increased the viewing distance from 7 to 10 meters. And we also worked with 119 gorilla guardians. We were able to analyze 762 gorilla fecal samples for COVID out of the 1,800 samples we collected that we looked at for parasites and other diseases. And we're glad to tell you that all of them were negative for COVID-19. And I think this is because these measures were put in place in March 2020. The mask wearing, the social distancing, it was put forward, and the hand hygiene, as well as temperature taking, was done just in time so that we're able to prevent the gorillas picking up COVID from people inside the park or when they're outside the park. And this was published in Frontiers for Public Health, where IUCN and European Union were acknowledged I'll encourage you to read this paper because it has a lot of information about how we're able to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Next slide, please. Another important threat we looked at was poaching. Could you please keep on? And one of the things, sadly, that happened is that this gorilla Rafiki, called Rafiki because he's friendly, was killed by a hungry bushmeat poacher. As you can see, this particular poacher was not killing gorillas. I mean, when he was found at his home, what he had in his home was actually heads of duiker, bush pig, but he spared the bush pig. And all of this happened because tourists were not coming, people were hungry, he could enter the park more easily, tourists were not coming, and he wanted food and also to sell to the local communities because a lot of them have come just to depend on tourism to survive. They had stopped doing things like planting, farming, cultivation, and just waiting for tourism dollars through maybe being a porter or selling crafts or accommodation. That's what they wanted. But during the pandemic, those dollars were not there and people were really struggling. So when he spared the bush pig, the gorilla charged to protect his family and he ended up sparing the gorilla in self-defense. And so as much as he was put in jail for 11 years, we knew that there were other hungry bushmeat poachers. And so we started a program called Ready to Grow, where we started off with providing to over 1,000 households who are most vulnerable, including the poacher's wife. She was only 22 with 3 children under the age of 3 and very desperate. And they all benefited from Ready to Grow. And as we distributed the questionnaires, majority said people were poaching because they were hungry. So a lot of what we did during COVID is continuing after COVID. And we also worked with 500 coffee farmers and trained them in sustainable agricultural practices. And during the pandemic, we were able to buy their coffee. We didn't necessarily hold many training sessions because of the pandemic and the numbers that you were allowed to hold. But were able to provide a market to 150 farmers. So we reduced 150 people from entering the forest to poach and collect firewood because they were hungry during the pandemic. We also provided stealth camera traps and GPS devices to Uganda Wildlife Authority to support gorilla health monitoring and anti-poaching, which doubled their monitoring capacity. So this particular lady is with the Ready to Grow. So some of the lessons next slide, please. Some of the lessons we saw were that overdependence on tourism is the threat. As much as tourism is a very good opportunity to sustain conservation efforts, and I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic was a natural experiment for that, because suddenly when tourism disappeared overnight, poaching went up everywhere, not only at Bwindi where we're working and Mugahinga, but all over many countries in Africa and many countries in the world. So it really showed that tourism has been supporting conservation and it needs to continue, but we need to be more intentional. But however, we found that, people are using tourism money to buy food. Yet before tourism began, they could plant food in their garden. So we helped them to develop these ready-to-go gardens using sustainable agriculture on a small plot, proper soil and water conservation, and that really helped. And sustainable financing for conservation needs to go beyond tourism. Through Gorilla Conservation Coffee, we got one of our best buyers from the UK who has ordered 15 times since the pandemic. Because whenever I give a presentation and say, even if you can't visit the gorillas, you can buy coffee and stop people entering the forest to poach, during lockdowns, she got a lot of sales and were able to support farmers and they didn't have to enter the forest to poach. So we need to find other ways to sustain conservation beyond tourism. The strong relationship with the government was very important. The Wildlife Authority, the Ministry of Health, and NGOs, as well as the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance, where we developed this policy brief on responsible tourism to great apes, both in English and French, for the 13 countries in Africa that have great ape tourism in 33 sites, so that everybody follows the protocol, mask wearing, social distancing, plus giving back to the community. So this, I felt, was a very important key lesson. To also scale up scalable approaches. And this was another key lesson that we got from this project. And in conclusion, emergency funding such as the IUCN SOS was necessary to minimize the impact of disease and poaching during the pandemic. That's what we found in the work we did. And holistic approaches, One Health approaches that combine the health of people, wildlife, and the environment together were very important to they are very important. And during the pandemic, it came into maturity. Because before that, people used to wonder, conservation through public health, why are you combining health and conservation, human health and animal health? But during the pandemic, a lot of people said, and donors, now we know what you're doing. And IUCN came through and gave us funding, 100,000 euros, to carry out this very critical activity, which really had a great impact on the gorillas and the local communities and other communities in other parts of Africa. Thank you so much, IUCN and European Union.
Thank you, Dr. Gladys. And for the attendants, please continue typing your questions in the chat. We will not open mics. You'll not be asking your question, but if you put your question in the chat, then after we finish with the last speaker, we will come back to all three presentations and we'll ask your questions. So no questions now, but please stay online, Gladys, because you will get questions. We're now moving over to Matthew Norval. Are you there, Matthew?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I am here.
You have the floor.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity. So also to obviously acknowledge the funding provided through this grant, and also, a big thanks to our partners. Next slide, please. So to acknowledge our partners, it really was an amazing collaboration between these different groups, our government department, environmental affairs, which is basically now referred to as forestry, fisheries and environment, and then their parastatal, which is SANBI, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and then various other NGOs such as Conservation South Africa and the Botanical Society, and we played the role of coordinating those activities. Next slide, please. So this project was concerned with looking at the succulent diversity in the succulent crew biome, which I'll describe a little bit now, and one species in particular, one genera rather, of a very small succulent plant called the conophytums, which I'll show you some pictures now. But maybe just a snapshot of the incredible biodiversity of the succulent crew biome. So sitting at obviously on the right at the bottom of the African continent, up the west coast of South Africa, and it straddles the Western and Northern Cape provinces and includes the WILDCRU region as well as the Namaqualand region. It's one of only 2 desert biodiversity hotspots in the world. And it's really exceptional amongst the world's desert regions because of its extraordinary rich diversity of plant species and has the richest succulent flora in the world. Incredible variety of vascular plants, 6,356, and of those 26% or 1,630 species are strict endemics that occur nowhere else on Earth. But in addition, there's almost another 1,000 species that are considered to be near endemics and have the center of their distribution in this biome. So a very special part of the world, a very special part of South Africa and obviously of the continent. Next slide, please. So this just gives you an idea of the situation as well as the problem. So the top left-hand image shows the typical habitat that you find these succulent plants. It's often characterized by small quartz pebbles. This is the habitat that these, particularly the conophytums, favor. The top middle picture shows one of the conophytums in flower. They're highly attractive in the international plant trade. And if you then look at the top right-hand picture, that's an image of plants that have been illegally harvested and then confiscated. That's how they get transported. The image just below that shows a haul of illegally harvested conophytums. You can see in a box there, just look at the number. That was 6,500 plants just in one particular incident. And then if you go on the bottom left of your screen, that's an up close of one of these conophytums, very charismatic plants, highly sought after, but obviously very specialized. The bottom middle plant, that red and yellow, is one of the clivias. Many of you will be familiar with those plants. This particular plant was only described just over a decade ago for the first time, occurring in one of the protected areas. It has literally been now poached to very close to extinction in the wild. So this is the nature of the problem. This is what we are facing, and this is what we sought the funding for to address. Next slide, please. Yeah, so basically the overall objective was to pilot emergency conservation interventions for a variety of succulent species in the succulent Karoo biome, but specifically looking at some of the conophytums. So we wanted to improve the conservation of rare and endemic conophytum succulent species, as well as subspecies, obviously. And then one of the kind of result areas was for us to look at suitable technology that could be identified for testing and piloting in the succulent Karoo, which would improve the protection of wild populations of succulent plants. So that was on the sort of tech side of things. Also, we, from the actual plant side of things, wanted to develop ex situ living collections of these plants in botanical gardens off-site, and then as well pulling across the importance of community responses. And so the project had a community-led response to develop basically a community-led response to the crisis. We also then wanted to have an aspect that looked at improving investigation and prosecution capacity, specifically in the Namaqualand region, just to see if that basically where it was and how that could be improved. Next slide, please. Yeah, maybe also just before I get into this, just wanted to pick up one of the points that Nadia introduced in her summary and introduction, and that was the term fragility. And I think if one summarizes the succulent Karoo and the threats to these succulent plants and the conophytums in particular, it's all to do with fragility. These are very, very fragile ecosystems, very easily damaged, and almost impossible to rehabilitate once that damage has taken place. So we developed the project with a holistic approach in mind, and this is the impact that we had. So we completed a desktop review of available technologies that were used both internationally and locally. And then we came up with a range of those that we thought could be piloted at remote locations. That's one of the challenges with technologies in that particular biome. It's extensive, remote, hostile, very, very hot, and arid, and some of the basics like cell phone signal non-existent. So in order to test some of these technologies, we erected 4 license plate recognition cameras that were added to an existing network. Limited network refers to a large area of the succulent Karoo that was completely uncovered by an existing camera network. So this grant allowed us to put up 4 additional camera sites, which already has generated successes. Of the target species that were monitored and then ex situ material collected, 35 of the 36 were collected, and then an additional 22 highly threatened conophytum species were added to ex situ conservation collections. The grant allowed all consumables that were required for managing and maintaining a viable conophytum collection in selected botanical gardens to be procured and distributed, as well as security infrastructure in these gardens to be upgraded. On the community side of things, the project enabled 5 workshops to be held with a total of 90 community representatives and other stakeholders attending. And then this resulted in a community and communication strategy emerging, which was written up as a result of the community members' input. That strategy to then contribute to combating the illegal poaching of succulent plants in the Namaqualand region and the Knaesvlakte region. Knaesvlakte is a little bit further south in the Namaqualand area in general. The grant also allowed us to develop or look at trends analysis around the trade. COVID definitely had a huge impact in that it changed the manner in which this illegal trade was taking place. In the past, what was happening, a lot of people were coming into the country from overseas. They were conducting the illegal activity themselves. With COVID not allowing international travel, suddenly contact was being made with local community members, and through WhatsApp and other social media channels, literally orders of illegal plants were being shared. And in a way, and this is a serious impact of COVID, and that the project enabled us to address, was the criminalization of some of these communities as a result of foreign collectors not being able to come in and collect for themselves. Also importantly, the project allowed us to implement capacity building and training workshops with 20 prosecutors and law enforcement officials and conservation agency partners. And already that has had some good impact with some reasonable sentences and some investigation success already emerging from that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so almost done. So some of the lessons learned from this project, I think we all know a holistic approach works best and is definitely needed. And that's what led to some of the successes. The partner mix is important. There are a lot of players in this particular aspect of conservation, and to find the right partners is important. Also learning to let organizations play to their strengths. Some organizations are good at communication, others are good at capacity building and training, others are good at on the ground activities. And so, yeah, we're certainly looking at that as we're developing ongoing projects. Clarity on roles and responsibilities. I think people get very excited about, particularly when funding is available and you now can jump in and have an impact. And it's very important that everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are to ensure that there's no kind of wasting of time and stepping on each other's toes. Lastly, the pilot projects such as this one can often catalyze action and funding. And yeah, I'm very pleased to report that this project has resulted in an ongoing project that we managed to pull together over 3 years. And it's basically taking all the lessons learned and all the results of this project and just ramping them up so that we can have additional action and reach. So thanks very much to our partners and to the funders, and gratefully acknowledged. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. Again, questions in the chat, please, and then afterwards Matthew will have some time to address them. Now on to Cameroon, where we have Dr. Aristide Kamla. Aristide, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can hear and see you. You have the floor.
All right, excellent. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to participate to this webinar. I'm so grateful to IUCN for inviting me to share the work that we've been doing in Lake Ossa, trying to protect the African manatee. So the picture that you see in front of you is one of my favorite places in the world. It's Lake Ossa. This is where my career actually started as a marine biologist 16 years ago. Lake Ossa is a protected area, a wildlife reserve with about 4,000 hectares of water surface. And this is a main source of living for more than 400 fishermen living around the lake. And it's a beautiful ecosystem hosting several species of birds, and also more than 36 species of fish and the African softshell sea turtle, and without mentioning the iconic species, the African manatee. Next slide. Yes, and this is my favorite wildlife species. I encountered the African manatee in Lake Ossa. By the way, Lake Ossa is the hotspot of the African manatee in Cameroon. You know, if there's a place you want to see the African manatee, come to Lake Ossa. And this species is a marine mammal, mostly herbivorous and distributed along the fresh and marine waters of the west coast of Africa. They are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN list, and they are threatened by poaching, accidental capture in fishing net, and habitat degradation. When I started manatee conservation in Lake Ossa, it was very common to see manatee poaching in the area, and also restaurant offering manatee meat. That was one of the reasons I founded AMCO, the African Marine Mammal Conservation Organization. And in collaboration with the government and other NGOs in the place, we were able to address manatee poaching. And today, there are no restaurants offering manatee meat. Next slide. As we were about to celebrate this success, this is what happened. Another threat, even more impactful than Salvinia. How will you feel if one day, just a sudden, you encounter this in your area, your lake becoming invaded by an intruder you have never thought of? Salvinia is an aquatic invasive species native from Brazil, but we don't know how it found its way to Lake Ossa around 2017. The plant doubled in biomass every 8 to 10 days, forming this thick carpet of floating vegetation that impacted the livelihood of the local community as they could barely do fishing activities. Next slide. It also impacted the life of the African manatee. You know, manatee is a mammal, you know, and should be able, and in order to breathe, they have to surface and stick their nose out of the surface of the water. But imagine this thick surface of vegetation blocking their movement to the surface. So, and that's why when Salvinia started spreading, the population of manatee, or the frequency of detection of manatee present in Lake Ossa has drastically reduced. It was even at the point that we couldn't even see a single manatee in the lake. Next slide. So that's where it's at that moment that we seek for the support from IUCN Rapid Action Grant to find a solution to this problem. The first solution that we initiated was the use of a manual removal, you know, using our hands, gathering the local community and going with our hands to try to remove this plant. But unfortunately, the manual removal was not effective enough at eradicating Salvinia, as the plant was multiplying faster than we could manually remove them. Therefore, we use an alternative method called the biological control, using an insect, the Salvinia weevil. This insect that you see on the screen is a natural predator of Salvinia. The weevil came from our partner, the Louisiana State University, who provided us with our first batch of weevil that we mass rear and get it ready to introduce into the lake. In order to introduce the weevil into the lake, we needed the approval from both the local community and the government, who initially was very skeptical to this approach. You know, there were a lot of propaganda around the approach. People were saying that the weevil will bite them, the weevil will cause diseases. The government, since it wasn't an approach that was applied in the country before, they was thinking that this approach could even make the problem worse than it is already. So we had to educate them and convince them, a task that was not easy at all. And it took almost 2 years to achieve this. Next slide. So in this graph, I want to show you a little bit how, in this figure, I want to show you how the evolution of our impact on Salvinia at the different, evolved at the different phases of our SOS Rapid Action Grant project. So as you can see on the graph, Salvinia started around 2017, but it was very, the coverage was still very small, you know, and it was even barely noticeable. It started heavily spreading around 2020. And this is at the moment we knock at the door of IUCN Rapid Action Grant, which we are so grateful that they quickly responded to our request. And then between the time we received the fund and the time you can see we introduced the weevil into the lake, it took almost 1.5 years. And while we were, and this took a long time because we were going through administrative procedures, and we were also trying to convince the local community, as I said earlier, to about the benefit of the biological control. And so we finally got it in July 2021, and we introduced the weevil into the lake. And our project, our RAC project ended around May or July 2022, and Salvinia was still there. And we were like, oh, we took this grant and we said that we're going to solve the problem, but the problem is still even worse than the moment we received the fund for. And it was a very frustrating situation. But I'm so grateful to IUCN for their patience, because they understood the effort that we were making, and that this is a nature problem. It's not like a mechanical problem that you can fix quickly. The nature responds whenever it's ready to respond. So yeah, then to the next slide, please. So, and then I want to show you, to summarize, I want to show how Salvinia looked like, you know, before we introduce the weevil. You know, the photo on your, I guess, your left. You could see how Salvinia was completely covering the northern part of the lake, and it was very green. It was very fresh. And 2 years later, no, about 4 years later, you can look how the lake look like now. You know, the Salvinia is almost cleared from the lake. Only in 2021, it was covering 50% of the surface lake. At the moment I'm talking, it's covering only 15% of the lake surface. And we, as a consequence of this success, we are seeing manatee coming back. So manatee are more frequent when we do our manatee surveys, and also the fishing activity has resumed in the lake. And I would like to use this opportunity to put some lessons that we learned from this action. We learned that involving the local community, the government, and other stakeholders is key to when responding to a crisis, because these are your best allies. And it's also very important to communicate and be transparent of the action that you are putting in place in order to reduce suspicions. And collaboration is also very important. Like we couldn't achieve this action alone. I'm not a botanist, and I'm not even an entomologist. So I had to collaborate with entomologists, with botanists, with many other experts in order to address this problem. So collaboration is very important. Collaboration with the government and with the local community as well. And also adaptive management is also very important. You know, before Salvinia came, it was not our priority, you know, to address invasive plant species. Our priority was just only manatee. We're caring only about manatee. But when this problem came, we needed to adjust our approach, because it was impacting not only the African manatee, but the local community that we are supporting. So the Rapid Action Grant has been very successful. It was our first support when this crisis started. And through this grant, we were able to even leverage additional support, which is helping us to continue the actions that we started in 2020. And through this, other organizations such as IUCN, the GF, the Japanese Fund for Environment, WILDCRU, NCPZ, WFN, and Biopama was also able to support. Next slide. Okay. So although we were having success eliminating Salvinia in Lake Ossa, the underlying cause, which is water pollution, was remaining unaddressed. My team and I are now working to conduct water analysis campaign in Lake Ossa and along the adjacent Sanaga River in order to understand the source of pollution into the lake. Next slide. Next slide, please. And finally, the solution to the pollution is something that should be addressed, in the multidisciplinary approach involving all the stakeholders. So this is why we organized the Street Manatee Festival in February 2024 this year. Through this event, we gather all the stakeholders on the same table to discuss about the issue related to the pollution in Lake Ossa. And in perspective, we plan to continue with the biological control, acquiring even a surface boat that will allow us to access this area that we cannot access with the classic type of boat that we are having now. So we need to access those areas to release the weaver there. So that's why you can see there's still 15% of Salvinia remaining. And we need also to continue monitoring manatee population and even tagging them to see how they behave with the presence and the absence of the Salvinia. And we need to continue providing more alternative livelihood to the local community. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I would like also to thank the IUCN Rapid Action Grant and also the European Union. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Aristide. Thank you. We just heard 3 amazing presentations of the work that was done with IUCN and EU funding. IUCN, stay online. We do have questions for you, but while we are still on the topic of field programs, we have some questions for the 3 speakers. Can I invite you to switch your videos on Gladys, Matthew, and Aristide? And I'm going to give you the questions now, each of you, and then if you could just quickly, 1, maximum 2 minutes per person, reflect on that question. The question for Gladys will be, what lessons can other people learn? Of course, we've watched your presentation, but please spell it out for us. What are the lessons that people in a different context can learn? For Matthew, the question is coming from a rodent person, but I'm addressing it to you because I want you to speak about how you find funding for non-charismatic species. A lot of conservation funding is for charismatic species. How do you, in the plant world, find funding? And finally, Aristide, the question that was addressed to you, I don't see the name there. There were 2 people who asked about pollution. So can you reflect on the importance of pollution? So first Gladys, then Matthew, then Aristide. Gladys?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the questions. I would say that some of the biggest lessons we learned was there really needs to be an emergency fund set aside for such emergencies. This time around it was a pandemic, and the different presentations have come up with different emergencies. Aristide was another emergency. I think Matthew was also looking at everybody. We were all looking at different emergencies, because if you don't have this fund put aside, all the efforts that you've been making can get wiped out in a very short time. For the gorillas, if they picked up COVID, that would be the end of tourism for not only the gorillas, but other national parks that are dependent on tourism from gorillas to support them and the communities around the park. So I think that was a very important lesson, that emergency funding should always be put aside for such situations. And it would be great if IUCN can continue this in the future with support from EU and other donors. I think another thing that everybody found was that we cannot over-rely on tourism, because as much as we see tourism as the way to sustain conservation efforts, to provide sustainable financing beyond grants, it's actually dangerous to over-rely on tourism. So a park like Bwindi that had it was started because of tourism. Really, when tourism disappeared overnight, things went really crazy. And so we need to find other ways to sustain conservation and be innovative, whether it's agribusiness, like we did with Gorilla Conservation Coffee, the ready to grow. We've actually continued all these things beyond the pandemic. In fact, we used whatever happened during the pandemic to continue to strengthen our programs so that we have more resilience and strengthening of communities. And I think the third thing that we really learned from all of this is the strong relationships we'd already built with the communities over the past like 16 years. By the time the pandemic came, we were able to build upon those community volunteer networks we had already set up, like the village health and conservation teams, community health workers doing conservation work, the gorilla guardians, the strong relationship with Uganda Wildlife Authority and the rangers. We're already training them. We just added this. So all of that and the NGOs in the area. So the fact that we already had these relationships and we just built upon them. With the Ministry of Health, we first started working with them when there were anthrax outbreaks. Queen Elizabeth National Park and hippos were dying. People were dying who were eating hippos. And so that's when we started working with them and we built up on different things like Ebola, Marburg, and now COVID. And so we need to just keep on building on those relationships. But I know that in this presentation, I think now everyone understands what One Health is, combining the health of people, animals, and the environment together. It's a very important holistic approach, which helps in many ways. It helped us to really strengthen responsible tourism to great apes, but also it helped us in so many other ways during the pandemic. So I'd love it if you can all embrace it, even where you are, Aristide and Matthew, start looking at One Health approaches in your communities to build upon the great conservation work you're already doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gladys. Thank you. Yes. Matthew, your turn.
Yeah, thanks very much. So as an organization, we're not only focusing on plants, but in fact, we've got quite a strong focus on protected area expansion. And in fact, how we got into the plant side of things, and obviously I'm trying to address how do we go about getting funding for plant conservation, was to make the very clear link between expanding protected areas that largely happened around in those parts of the country around plant conservation. So if you're expanding, you're adding hectares, but yet you're losing the very plants that you built the protected areas around, that's a problem. So people generally understand the need for protected areas, and then you can kind of weave the story down to the plants that are being lost. But then also maybe just something that's not always that well known is that the criminality around illegal trades in plants is often linked to other illegal trades. So there have been cases in South Africa that are linked to abalone that a lot of you will be familiar with, and then even rhino horn and other illegal activities. So, while plants are not necessarily seen as charismatic, as soon as you can show links with other more charismatic species such as rhino, there's no doubt that you can, that's how we've gone about it. Also, I think the argument, that plants are some of the basic components of ecosystems. So if plants are removed and destroyed in some of these very sensitive arid ecosystems, then the very basis of conservation is lost. So we've used that, and then finally maybe links to tourism. So a lot of you will have seen images from Namaqualand of these amazing displays of annual plants. And while those plants aren't the subject of legal trade, the plants in general have got a tourism value. And so we often link that back to sustainable tourism. Gladys, picking up your point and completely understanding and agreeing with you that you need to be careful of relying on tourism, but it's just one component. And I suppose, we haven't necessarily called it One Health, but we refer to it maybe in a more general terms, protected areas, functional ecosystems, communities, and livelihoods, and kind of links to food security all go together to make for good conservation, but also for stable communities around conservation areas. So it's, I guess one's looking for that win-win. But it's challenging. Plant conservation is not often on the top of the list, and that's why we are very grateful that we could pilot some of our activities. Thanks, Hans.
Thank you, Matt. Aristide, your turn, please.
Yes. So talking about pollution in Lake Ossa, this is a very serious issue. It's about nutrient pollution, mostly from nitrogen and phosphorus. In 2016, we started monitoring the concentration of these two nutrients into the lake. By then, and then we compare it with the historical value, which in 1985, the lake had very low concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus. And then when we measure it in 2016, we realized that the values have doubled. And then in 2019, we did another measure, and that value had doubled from the previous one. And we realized that there was a building up of nutrient concentration into the lake. And what was striking is that when we were looking at the gradient of these concentrations, it was highest. It was highest at the mouth of the lake. So, and the lake communicates with the largest river of the country, the Sanaga River, which the watershed cover almost 1/3 of the country size. So, and that water, the water from the river can go into the lake and vice versa. And so this made us to realize that most of those nutrients are coming from this adjacent river. And that if we need to address the pollution into Lake Ossa, we need to, to zoom out a little bit and address the problem at the level of a larger landscape. So which is the reason we are doing monitoring of the nutrient concentration, not only in Lake Ossa, but also along the Sanaga River, on which there are a lot of, industrial activity that we think might be impacting on the concentration of nutrient. We're talking about, for example, agro-industries. There's like huge sugarcane agro-industry in the landscape. Sometimes we find that where some of them were even discharging some of their industrial waste directly into the river without counting the fact that they're using some pesticide or herbicide, a fertilizer that with runoff find themselves into the river. And there's also like some dams that are being constructed. There's hydroelectric reservoir to capture water that would be used to fuel or to run the turbines that would generate electricity. So there's one side in one area in Cameroon, which is almost 500 kilometers square, that has been flooded with a lot of trees. With it, all those trees are underwater and they're slowly decomposing, and maybe that could be also one of the causes. So that's also like even local agricultural activities that are taking place also within that landscape. So we need to try to sort out, see where are the main source of pollution coming from. So thank you.
Thank you, Aristide. Thank you, all three of you. Maybe we'll have a next round after this question, but I first want to ask, actually, Gladys asked it. Gladys, that's your question. What is going to be the mechanism that's going to be available in terms of funding after this program? And I think Anne and Nadia, I don't know which, the two of you, do you want to take that question jointly, or maybe we should start with Anne? Anne, do you want to take that question? What will be available in terms of emergency response?
Thank you. That's a tough question, and it would be great to also hear some comments from Nadia. But just to say that we currently do not have a planned call for proposals. However, that is not to say that our commitment has diminished or our interest has diminished. We continue to be, committed to supporting frontline actors and the work that they're doing. And so, no clear yes or no, but is really to say we're working really hard to ensure that we can secure additional resources to be able to continue this work.
Nadia, do you want to respond?
Yes, thank you. I can just complete with how the European Union has been continuing its work on conservation. And, we work on what we call multi-annual financial frameworks. So the current one goes from 2021 to 2027, and we have priorities and approaches, and biodiversity and conservation in sub-Saharan Africa are extremely high on the agenda. But also, I will not go into details, but also because of changes in the way of working, we have in this framework focused much more on what we call complicated word geographicization, meaning that the funding looks at communities, governance, conservation in an integrated and comprehensive way, but along key landscapes for conservation and development. So there has been a study some time ago, larger than elephants, that has identified the key landscapes. There are 6 landscapes across sub-Saharan Africa, and it has been decided to focus, as I said, 360 degrees, so continuing to work with communities very much, and around protected areas and on conservation matters, but around these landscapes. So let's say that for the time being, we have a bit sort of focused our approach on this. And our idea since the beginning was to contribute to this funding in a way also to make it known and relevant for other donors to come in. So just to say that while we don't continue specifically the emergency response one for the time being, we are still very much working on the continent on conservation.
Thank you, Anne and Nadia. We have 3 minutes left. I don't think we'll have time for a complete round. If you put a question in the chat, perhaps people can also respond in the chat. I don't think we can deal with all the questions. Let me just take one last one, and it's a question to Gladys. What were some of the primary challenges you faced during your rapid response? Gladys, do you want to talk about your primary challenge? Mike, in 2 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I would say that some of the challenges we faced were, it was a state of emergency all over the world, and we had to get permission to become essential workers during the pandemic so we could carry out this conservation work. Thankfully, because of the good relationship we had with the Ministry of Health, and because they understood, everybody in the country understood that if we lose the gorillas or chimpanzees, the whole country will suffer. Not just the conservation sector, because 70% of tourism comes from great apes, which manages so many things along the way, so many people along the value chain, not only the conservation actors, the tourism, the local communities, right from the airport. So everybody was concerned about it, and we immediately were able to quickly get that permission to travel all through the pandemic. So we're actually extremely busy all through the pandemic. I think that was probably one of the biggest challenges, trying to get that sorted. And then also the social distancing. We ended up having 20 small workshops instead of 2 or 3, because you could only have a maximum of 10 people, 5 people or 10 people per gathering. And so we had to spend a lot of time doing an activity, but at the same time, we were able to really do it well with everyone because we could really talk to everyone and discuss. So generally, those were the main things all around. The social distancing regulations as one of the biggest things. But obviously also fundraising. We lost some donors because they also struggled, but we also gained new donors during the pandemic. And yeah, I would say that those were the biggest challenges we faced during the pandemic.
Thank you. Aristide, did you want to say something?
Yes, sure, yeah. Hold on, I'm trying to activate my camera. All right. Yes. Yeah, for me, the major challenge, as I mentioned a little bit during my presentation, was the skepticism of not only the local community, but even worse, the government. We had to organize multiple meetings with the government, explaining them how this biological control is going to work. We even have to do some experiments at a small size in our office in Lake Ossa, in the Zange near Lake Ossa, to demonstrate them the specificity, which means showing them that the weevil will only feed on Salvinia and nothing else. And until they follow the process through. And we also involve the local community in that process when we were doing that experiment. It's only when that experiment was conclusive that they say, okay, we're gonna give you the green light. So I think that was our main limitation. The funding was there. We had funding to do the work, but we didn't have the clearance from the government and from the local community. But we are glad that they finally understood, and today they are the first to praise the biological control. Even though I will tell them, not to overpraise the biological control because it had to be well controlled. Otherwise, it's not all biological control that works. You need to discuss with experts to make sure that is the proper one, and it needs to be monitored very clearly and have alternative plans in case something goes wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Listening to the presentations, reading the report, and especially these last few remarks, I realized that even though it's emergency funding, there's no cutting corners. When we look at the activities, it's capacity building, it's community engagement, working within government restrictions. This is work that normally takes years, and still you have to do it in an emergency setting. I guess it's just inspiring to see how people have come through these crises, and how amazing results have been achieved. I think there's much more we can learn, and I repeat that the report is online. People can consult it there. I hope that there will be more answers in the chat. The recording of this webinar will also be available on the SOS website, but I'm afraid that we're running out of time. We're 3 minutes over time according to the program, but we still have a few minutes for some closing remarks by Ana Nieto. Ana, over to you.
Right, sorry, Hans, I was struggling to unmute. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, super. No, I just wanted to, I don't want to extend further the webinar, apologizing as well for the delay. But I really find that it has been a very inspiring session, and I really hope that everybody has gained valuable insights from the stories and the experiences that our speakers have told us. I really found them very, very interesting. And these rapid action grants is really a powerful reminder of what can be achieved when we act swiftly and collaboratively in a holistic approach, as our speakers have been mentioning, in the face of conservation challenges. So thank you to our speakers. Your efforts really are making a real difference, and we're very proud to support your crucial and meaningful work. Thank you, Hans, for facilitating the session. Thank you to our interpreters that have made this possible in both languages, in English and French. Thank you to the European Union, and also to our colleagues which are in the background making this webinar a possibility. I just want to say that the commitment of IUCN for making funding available for emergencies is there. We want to continue this work in Africa, also scaling up to other continents, very much in need of this type of funding available. And check the report in our website and in the link that is being provided. And thank you, everybody, and see you at the next webinar.
Thank you very much, everyone. Closing down.